All right, everyone, we are back and we are continuing the cardiovascular system this week, talking about blood. So, before break, we talked about the heart and vessels. That was on the second exam. So, this is our first week of Unit 3 for lecture material, and we're going to get into blood. So we've got a few different learning objectives here. We're going to look at the different parts of blood, what their jobs are, talk a little bit about structure and function of certain types of blood cells, and then we are going to talk about blood typing and touch on just a couple of different blood disorders in this chapter. So blood is made up primarily of 3 cell types and then a lot of fluid to hold these different types of cells. So we have erythrocytes, also known as red blood cells, and then platelets and white blood cells, which are also referred to as leukocytes. We'll talk a lot more about the white blood cells when we do the immune system a little bit later on in the semester, because that's where their primary function is within the immune system, but we will touch on them a little bit today since they are technically blood cells. The fluid that holds all of these different cells is called plasma, and so that is going to be a lot of water and some different types of proteins and other substances inside of it. So this first section, section 2, we are going to talk about some different functions, the different components of blood, a little bit about the physical characteristics of it, and then look at the composition of that blood plasma and some of the really important parts of that plasma. So the main functions of blood, its number one function, primary function, is to take oxygen and nutrients to all of the cells of the body and then remove waste products from those body cells and deliver them back to whatever organ they need to go to for processing. So this transportation is going to include those nutrients again, picking that up from the digestive system. It's going to go to the liver usually for processing and then get distributed out to the body cells. Gas transportation, this is going to be taking oxygen to cells and picking up the carbon dioxide and delivering it back into the lungs to be expelled. It's definitely going to deliver hormones. We've talked about hormones already and how they are traveling through the bloodstream to reach whatever their target cells are. And then again, we are also going to be picking up waste products from the body cells and taking them back to generally liver or kidneys to have those waste products filtered out. Another function of blood is defense. So like I mentioned a little bit ago, those leukocytes, the white blood cells, their job is to fight off pathogens, so bacteria, viruses, fungi, and other things that could potentially make us sick. And they're also going to destroy mutated cells. So when that DNA gets mutated and we start going down a path where those cells could or have become cancerous, leukocytes are the cells responsible for taking care of those and killing those off, usually before they start causing any issues. Obviously, that doesn't always happen perfectly. People do still get cancer, but the vast majority of cancerous cells are going to get taken care of by those leukocytes who recognize that they are not normal body cells. And then the platelets, which aren't technically a cell, they start out as a big cell called a thrombocyte, and then break off into these little chunks, but their job is to help with blood clotting. So anytime we get a damaged blood vessel from a cut or a scrape or anything, or any type of internal injury, then the platelets are going to go ahead and start forming a clot to protect and stop that blood loss. And then our last function of blood is maintenance of homeostasis. And so body temperature is one way that our bloodstream helps maintain body temperature. And so if we are too warm and we need to cool off a little bit, we can actually push more blood flow closer to the surface of the skin so that the heat contained in the bloodstream is able to be let off through the skin. And on the flip side of that, if we're really, really cold, we're going to keep blood flow away from the skin surface and even the extremities in some cases, which is why, generally speaking, your fingers and toes are going to start getting cold first, is because we're limiting blood flow to those because they're not as essential. Our blood is also going to help with chemical balances in our bloodstream, so maintaining the pH, make sure our blood is not too basic or too acidic. It needs to stay within a certain range, and so it's going to be maintaining that through some different methods and make sure it stays within the proper parameters. And then the water content of cells is also regulated through blood, among other parts of the body, but making sure that the cells have the appropriate amount of water available to them and inside of them is really, really, really important for our homeostasis. So blood, all of these different components can be separated out into a tube so we can look at the different components. And so some of you, if you've ever seen blood test results, you may recognize some of these terms like the hematocrit. And so hematocrit is just the percentage of the blood that is made up exclusively of red blood cells. So this is going to give an indication of the oxygen and overall gas carrying capacity of the bloodstream. And so different sexes do tend to have slightly different normal ranges for hematocrit. Obviously, this is not going to apply to everybody. People can be a little bit outside of this range and still be perfectly healthy, but that has to do with the hormones available and overall composition of the body, muscle percentage versus fat percentage, and other structures in the body. So that hematocrit, how many of those erythrocytes are present in the blood? And so that'll tell, again, oxygen carrying capacity, because the stuff that carries oxygen is found in red blood cells. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the next section that you can see, very, very small part of the overall blood composition, is something called the buffy coat. This is going to be composed of the white blood cells or leukocytes, and then also the platelets. So as you can see, there are far more red blood cells in our blood than these white blood cells and platelets. The white blood cells and platelets are still obviously very, very important, but they don't make up as big of a percentage of our overall blood composition. And a lot of the white blood cells in our body can actually be found out in the body tissues rather than directly in the blood vessels. So we do have a lot more white blood cells than what you would think just based on this particular image looking at this composition of blood, but that is because those cells have migrated out into the tissue and are doing other functions within those tissues. And then our third component up here is that plasma. Again, this is mostly water with some different proteins, nutrients, hormones, and a bunch of other stuff in it that we'll talk about in just a little bit. All right. And so sometimes that hematocrit can also be referred to as packed cell volume. And so this is because this blood gets spun down in a centrifuge. So the heavier components end up at the bottom of the tube, lighter ones end up at the top. And so you can see a couple different other scenarios over here. So this first tube is normal blood. Here in the middle is an example of what somebody's blood could look like if they have a type of anemia. There's different types of anemia. We're not going to go into a ton of detail about that this week, but we will touch on it a little bit. And so we are seeing in this case a type of anemia due to a just overall lack of red blood cells. So that's going to decrease the amount of oxygen that can be transported around, among other things. And it's going to make somebody feel really tired and sluggish and stuff like that. And so then most of that blood ends up being comprised of this plasma. And then polycythemia, this is when we have more red blood cells than what we should. This can also cause some issues, but it's definitely not as common as the different types of anemia are. Another issue that could come from the polycythemia is obviously we're getting a lot less plasma because we're replacing that with a lot of the red blood cells, and so that can cause issues with blood pressure regulation and stuff, because that water balance is really important to blood pressure regulation among a lot of other components. So red blood cells shown here, we've got a couple different drops that look a little bit different. They're different shades. And so blood's going to be a little bit viscous, so a little bit thicker than just plain water. But what we're looking at here is oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. So oxygenated blood is going to be this very bright red over here, and that has to do with the hemoglobin, which carries the oxygen. We'll talk about that a little bit later in another video. And then over here on the right, we are seeing deoxygenated blood. So it's still red, but it's a lot darker, as you can see. And so this is one of the reasons that our veins are really visible. Part of it is because our veins tend to be a lot closer to the skin than the arteries do. Arteries are a lot more maybe not important, but they need to be protected a lot more than veins do because they have a much higher blood pressure to them. But part of that color from our veins is because the blood is darker, but it is not going to be green or blue or purple or anything like that. The veins do look that color, but that has to do with the pigments in our skin rather than the actual blood itself. And we're going to wrap up this particular video talking about some different components of blood, looking into this in a little bit more detail. So again, that plasma is making up a pretty significant portion of our overall blood volume. And so 92% of that roughly is going to be water again, because we need water to maintain our blood pressure. We need it for our cells. We need a lot of water, all right? And so that fluid gets absorbed from the intestinal tract. Sometimes it's produced through metabolism in small quantities, but this is really just going to be kind of that overall transport medium. If you don't have enough water in your bloodstream, then you are going to have a decrease in blood pressure, and that can cause lightheadedness and dizziness and stuff like that. Plasma proteins are going to make up roughly 7% of that overall plasma. Albumin is a really important protein that's found there. It's made in the liver, and as you can see, it's going to help maintain those osmotic concentrations, which is going to be that water balance, and it's also going to help transport lipid molecules around. And so lipid molecules can include a lot of different things that are super essential to our body's function, like sterols and steroids and stuff like that. So some hormones are going to be those lipid-based hormones, and then other things for the coating of our lungs and stuff like that, which we'll get into when we cover the respiratory system. Globulins make up another part of the plasma proteins. We have some different types of globulins produced in different parts of the body. A couple of these, as you can see, are going to help with that osmotic concentration as well, so water balance, as well as transporting various different components. And then this last group down here, the gamma globulins, also sometimes called immunoglobulins, these are going to be produced in the plasma cells, and these are a really important part of our immune response. These are our antibodies. These are the little molecules that we produce after an infection with a certain pathogen so that our body and our immune system actually remembers that pathogen and can more efficiently attack it if we get infected with it again. And so again, we'll touch a little bit more on this when we cover the immune system later, but that's a really important component there. And then fibrinogen, small percentage also produced in the liver, but this is really important for blood clotting. All right, so it's going to make some fibrous proteins and stuff like that that are going to form a mesh network over an injured blood vessel. So those are really important. Then we've also got some regulatory proteins like hormones and enzymes, and then a combination of other solutes like nutrients, gases, and waste products. And so that's all making up plasma. And then those formed elements, which refer to the cells and platelets, are going to be our erythrocytes again, the red blood cells, leukocytes or white blood cells, and then those platelets. And so we've got some different types of leukocytes. We'll talk a little bit more about those later this week, and then more in detail in the immune system chapter. But most of these cells are produced in the bone marrow, the red bone marrow specifically. Some of them finish out their development in certain other tissues, like lymphatic tissues for certain types of white blood cells. And then they've all got different jobs. Erythrocytes are going to transport gases. Those white blood cells, again, are part of our immune system. And then platelets are important for hemostasis. which is a part of homeostasis. This is that maintenance of blood loss. So if we have that damaged blood vessel again, that's going to help prevent too much blood from being lost. All right, and so we've got some different structures of blood cells. We'll look a little bit more in detail about them in another video this week, but erythrocytes actually do not have a nucleus at all, so we'll talk more about that later. Leukocytes, when they're stained in a specific staining process, they are going to have a lot of very dark staining nuclei, as well as some other structures inside of them. So we'll get into a little bit more detail about this, but again, red blood cells making up most of that types of cells, and then we've got some other types of white blood cells that we'll cover later, and then those platelets, these are again cellular fragments contained in a plasma membrane. These have special granules that are going to help release some of those fibrous proteins and stuff like that to form a mesh and block off blood vessels that have been damaged. And we will continue talking about erythrocytes specifically in our next video.